The most notable reason wrongful convictions take place worldwide is when police investigators participate in tunnel vision, which in a great number of cases leads to faulty testimony coming before a court. Tunnel vision has been described as a single-minded and overly narrow focus on a particular investigative or prosecutorial theory so as to unreasonably color the evaluation of information received and one's conduct, most particularly the police, in the response to that information.
The consequences of tunnel vision can be quite devastating. In the worst case, innocent people might be convicted for crimes they never committed. Tunnel vision is one of the most common reasons why crime investigations go wrong. It happens when detectives hone in on a single suspect or a single scenario and become blind to alternatives. Key to understanding tunnel vision is a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. We have a strong preference for information that confirms what we already believe to be true, while we tend to avoid conflicting information. And this bias makes it surprisingly difficult to change our minds. To prevent tunnel vision, we're currently developing tools like checklists and computer software, but we also need to educate detectives about this problem.
Quite simply, the police make a decision, usually very early in an investigation, that a certain suspect is in fact guilty, and then tailor the collection of evidence or the taking of statements by both witnesses and victims to conform to their conclusions. This is done often by ignoring evidence that is exculpatory, which leads away from guilt. When evidence is incorrectly filtered, a biased approach develops. Quite often, this is reinforced as police assigned to the case investigate without critically assessing the evidence. The results can be devastating. There are some predisposing circumstances that foster wrongful convictions with respect to tunnel vision that include things like public pressure brought on by the media to convict in serious, high-profile cases. Such cases, particularly those involving gruesome facts, tend to inflame the passions and create intense pressure on the police to arrest as quickly as possible. An unpopular suspect, someone who is seen as an outsider, or a member of a minority group gives rise to narrowing the focus of an investigation. All of this takes place in an environment that has converted the criminal justice process into a game where the pursuit of truth has surrendered to strategies, maneuvering, and a desire to win at virtually any cost. This is often the result of confirmation bias. We also have the phenomenon of noble cause corruption, which is the illegitimate sister of tunnel vision, where the police believed it is justifiable to fabricate or artificially improve evidence or in some other fashion bend the rules to secure the conviction of someone they are convinced are guilty. This behavior is acknowledged as part of what is seen as a police culture, which includes false testimony, excessive force, illegal searches, surveillance, and other questionable police strategies. It covers a broad range of conduct that masks itself as legitimate on the premise that the guilty must be brought to justice. This is despite evidentiary, substandard, or constitutional considerations that are seen as simply getting in the way. There are famous cases in various jurisdictions that highlight how tunnel vision has resulted in a wrongful conviction. In the USA, there is the case of Dr. Sam Shepard, who is a neurosurgeon. He was exonerated in 1966, having been convicted of the 1954 murder of his wife, Marilyn Shepard. The case was controversial from the beginning, with extensive and prolonged nationwide media coverage. In Canada, we have the nationally recognized wrongful conviction of Donald Marshall Jr. He was an Indigenous activist and the first high-profile victim of a wrongful murder conviction being overturned. The officers of the Sydney, Nova Scotia Police Department had little experience or training in conducting a homicide investigation. They rejected an offer of assistance from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. No autopsy was performed on the victim's body. The crime scene wasn't secured or photographed. A cursory search of the location turned up little evidence and no murder weapon. No case illustrates the plight of an outsider or an unpopular defendant better than that of Lindy Chamberlain, convicted in Australia for the 1980 killing of her 9-week-old daughter, Azaria. The Crown's case lacked any evidence of motive or confession, and neither a murder weapon nor the body of the child was ever found. Mrs. Chamberlain contended that a dingo had run off with her daughter. A royal commission concluded that there was absolutely no evidence of human involvement in the child's disappearance and apparent death. Lastly, there are the dozens of wrongful convictions in the United Kingdom involving egregious acts of police brutality and evidence fabrication against innocent individuals who were erroneously identified as IRA terrorists who had been bombing English pubs. Jerry Conlon was an Irishman known for being one of the Guildford Four who spent 15 years in prison after being wrongly convicted. Conlon continued to protest his innocence, insisting that police had tortured him into making a false confession. On October 19, 1989, he was vindicated when the Court of Appeal in London ruled that police had fabricated the handwritten interrogation notes used in the conviction. Crucial evidence proving Conlon could not have carried out the bombings had been held back by the police in the original trial. Most notably, the police falsely claimed that they had been unable to locate a homeless man who Conlon had been using drugs with in a local park at the time of the bombings.
I've been in prison 15 years for something I didn't do, for something I didn't know anything about. Totally innocent man. I watched my father die in a British prison for something he didn't do. He is innocent, the Maguires is innocent. Let's hope the Birmingham 6 and next
Giuseppe Conlon came to London town, bring his son home. See justice done, Lord Donaldson was put in command with him justice laws, with a slide of his hand in that man.
I was kidnapped from my bed by soldiers with grease paint on their faces, dragged from my bed, handcuffed and taken to a police station and tortured. I was then hooded and handcuffed and flown to a foreign country, England, and tortured again. And in the period of 7 days, the British government, and I don't say the British police, I say the British government, Roy Jenkins in particular, Merlin Rees as well, one of those two signed a form that gave immunity to the police who were allowed to torture us. And I mean torture. To be held naked, to have Alsatian dogs set upon you, to be taken out naked to country lanes, hooded, handcuffed, the hood taken off and told to open your mouth. And when I shook my head, they hit me in the head with a revolver, and I went, oh, and they stuck the gun in my mouth, pulled the hammer back and pulled the trigger. This is what they did. This is what they were allowed to do. This is why no policeman has ever been convicted of not just framing the Guildford Four, the Maguire 7 and the Birmingham 6, but any innocent prisoner. And then we were taken before a judge. And the outcome was already decided. The only thing it was, and the balance was the length of time we would get. And Donaldson, on the 22nd of October, 1975, when we were found guilty of a crime we didn't commit, said that he wanted to know from the Home Secretary why the proper legislation was no longer on the statute book, why hanging wasn't available as a sentence to him. And he looked at us, myself, Carol Richardson, who's now dead, by the way, Carol died last year, 55 years of age. Several breakdowns in prison, being administered mind-altering drugs. Came out to a world she didn't understand. Confused. Went to live with her lawyer, Alistair Logan. I went to live with Gareth. And she went into Guildford one day. And the people in Guildford came up to her and expressed their sorrow and horror and pain of what had happened to her. And she couldn't take it. And she went back and she decided she didn't want to go out and be recognised again. So she ate herself to 22 stone and was still taking psychotic drugs from the legacy of the horror she went through at prison. And in my head, I still hear Carol's screams on the 22nd of October when they dragged her down the stairs, and could hear her feet being dragged along the corridor by male screws, and the whimpering of her and the howls of her, and then the doors opening and them going in and administrating an injection to her to calm her down. Carol was never the same.
Giuseppe Conlon.
Thank you. Our next video lesson will be on mistaken eyewitness identification.